All right. Good evening, everyone. We ready to start here in the back? Okay. Welcome, welcome. It's great to see you all. Thank you for coming out tonight for our conversation with David French. By the way, he is not the only high-profile person visiting Phoenix this week. You may have seen that Border Czar Tom Homan was here, and so was Secretary of Homeland Security Christine Noem. She was seen in pictures with ICE agents posing with her bulletproof vest and holding a machine gun, an image that was striking fear not just in immigrants, but in every dog in the valley out here. Been working on that one all week. Okay, just a couple housekeeping matters. If you do have your cell phone, and I know at least one or two of you have it out there that haven't turned it off or silent, please go ahead and do that now. Our event is being live streamed today, so anything you say or do will be recorded in perpetuity until Elon Musk wipes it off of the cloud and Doge takes its hammer to it, or its chainsaw. To our online audience, you too can participate in this event. If you have questions, you can submit them to csrc@asu.edu when the question time arrives, but if you've got them at any point, go ahead and start submitting that. And of course, for those of you who are joining us in person, please stick around afterwards for a reception in the lobby, but you have to stay for the whole thing to get cookies. All right. In addition to today's event, we've got some other great upcoming events. On Tuesday, April 15th at 4 p.m. In West Hall, 135, we're going to be inviting Carolyn Chen, who will give a talk entitled "Work, Pray, Code: Silicon Valley Spirituality," discussing her experiences engaging with tech, some of the tech world's best and brightest, and the unique way that spirituality and productivity intersect. And then just 1 week later, on Tuesday, April 22nd, at 3 p.m., also West Hall, Susanna Crockford from the University of Exeter in England will give a talk entitled "The Missing Middle: Cosmopolitics of Spirituality in Arizona." She's done a lot of work on Sedona. So both of these are part of our Spirituality and Public Life initiative. I encourage you to attend both. Check out our website. You can sign up just like you signed up for this event. You did sign up for this event, didn't you? I think you did. Okay. All right. I want to thank our, as always, our donors, our friends of the center who make everything that we do possible here, from student programs and scholarships to events like tonight's. Thank you. If you'd like to learn more about becoming a friend of the center, talk to Brittany Martin. Where is Brittany? She can help you out there in the back row. Okay. All right, now on to the good stuff. Tonight's event is the capstone public event of our Center's Recovering Truth project. And I want to say just a little bit about what that project is so you have a sense of this. So you may know that over the last few years, our project's been surveying a political landscape that is marked by the normalization of lying, the mainstreaming of conspiracy theories, the vastness of misinformation and disinformation, the dissolution of civic trust and commitments to truth and to truth-telling. Now, we define truth here not in any grand way, but simply as a body of shared facts, a common view of reality, acceptance of the processes and institutions by which claims can be shown to be true or false, that they can be evidenced, tested, confirmed, or corrected, right? We now find ourselves, and have been for quite some time, in an era of post-truth politics, a distinctive, grave, and unprecedented era, well beyond politics as usual, that's, the politics as usual, that's the sort of your run-of-the-mill political spin, exaggeration, etc. At least in my lifetime, this is unprecedented. And I think what's particularly pernicious about post-truth politics is its threat to democracy, including our elections and the peaceful transfer of power, its challenge to the constitutional republic, including the rule of law, the separation of powers, a commitment to self-government, and its aggravation of the most severe political polarization in American life for a long, long time. People are not just divided over their differences about abortion or welfare or things of this nature. It's not even about segregation. They are now divided over basic facts and features of reality. In our post-truth culture, the forces of autocracy, demagoguery, populism conflate truth with power. such that those who display disloyalty are designated liars or enemies of the people. Governments set policies that punish, diminish, or neuter those who appeal to any kind of external moral, legal, historical, religious, or other standard, some other basis of criterion by which something can be judged, because that challenges authoritarians' power to define reality, to define truth, and they do so to their benefit. So our task in this dire moment is at once simple and exceedingly difficult: to recover a commitment to truth, good faith commitments to truth-telling and the repudiation of lying, to standards of evidence by which claims can be shown, to a shared account of reality, even as we argue about different interpretations or we emphasize certain features of it, and to a view of the future that's defined by shared facts and minimal values that can make this American experiment in self-government worthy of preserving. It is in this spirit, in this moment, that we have selected as the featured speaker for our capstone event, David French, someone who I think embodies many of these commitments, many of these concerns and principles, and has, I would add, paid quite some cost for that. So let me introduce him now, and we'll bring him in, and my co-moderator, Tracy Fessenden, up on the stage here. David French is an opinion writer, as most of you know, at the New York Times. He focuses on religion, democracy, polarization in America. He's a former constitutional lawyer. He has defended free speech, religious freedom, due process. He has served in the Army JAG Corps, deploying to Iraq and earning a Bronze Star. As a Navy veteran, I promise not to bring up the Army-Navy thing or who won that football game last fall. His best-selling book, Divided We Fall, examines the dangers of polarization and the importance of engaging with opposing viewpoints. He is committed in promoting dialogue and understanding across religious, cultural, and moral differences. Won't you please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to David French. And I'd also like to invite Tracy Fessenden to the stage now. Welcome. Thank you.
I will note for the record, you did bring up the Army-Navy game.
Second time tonight, actually.
Second time tonight. Yeah, exactly.
But I won't do it again.
Should we start? Yeah.
Please.
Okay, David French, thank you so much for joining us. What a thrill to have you with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. And just to tell you how much I love being at Arizona State, I skipped the Luca's first game back in Dallas for this. He scored 45, and Lakers won. I know everyone cares, but
He does bear the sacrifices for the work that he does and his commitments, so clearly.
David, you've described yourself politically as a man without a party, and you've written very movingly about being a Christian whose church has, who is separated from your church not voluntarily, right? So in that sense, you may also be a man without a church. But it wasn't always thus. 10 years ago, you were a staunch culture warrior on the right, operating from within your strong evangelical Christian faith. So help us to understand what happened. What has your path been since then, and what is the landscape that path cuts through? And then maybe say a little bit about how your own religious networks and church experiences have been part of your effort to resist Trumpism and maintain your moral principles at some cost to you.
yeah, I think one of the things is I made the mistake of believing us. And here's what I mean. In 1998, the Southern Baptist Convention, I'm not a Southern Baptist. I grew up in, for people who have heard of this, the a cappella Churches of Christ, a sort of a very fundamentalist background. As my friend Sheree Harder from the Trinity Forum says, we did not put the fun in fundamentalism. So I did not grow up Southern Baptist, but in 1998, when Bill Clinton was in the depths of the Monica Lewinsky scandal, you remember this time, For those of you who are in the audience who are old enough to remember it, America was peaceful. It was very prosperous. Things were going pretty darn well. This is when, the Cold War had ended. The French had coined the term for America that we were not a superpower, we were a hyperpower. Things seemed to be going well. And then you had this president who engaged in a lot of terrible misconduct. And so in 1998, the Southern Baptist Convention put out a statement on the moral character of public officials. And I used to have large segments of it memorized because I was very fond of quoting it. And very fond of quoting it, at the early time in the Trump years. But there's one part of it that I remember very well. And it said, and this is 1998, Southern Baptist taking a stand, and it said, tolerance of serious wrong by leaders sears the conscience of the culture, spawns unrestrained lawlessness, and surely will result in God's judgment. Okay? And I was like, yep, I think that's right. Another shorthand way of saying it is character is destiny. And so I remember when Trump came down the escalator, I was in this position where I thought, and this is my mistake, I thought that there were going to be very strong antibodies against him, particularly within the Christian conservative movement. And so as he grew in popularity, I kind of had this slowly dawning realization that went like this. We're not doing this. We're doing this. And my position was that original stance in 1998 was correct, okay? And nothing about Donald Trump confronting Hillary Clinton changed Donald Trump's character to make it better. And so therefore, the responsibility of Christians, in my view, was to, in essence, sort of essentially be like the conscience of the nation. In other words, we're going to not vote for a candidate of a party that we would traditionally vote for because we have staked out a clear moral ground. And that did not happen. Not only did that not happen, it was worse than not happening. So in 2011, there was an interesting poll done that showed that of all of the major American subgroups, white evangelicals were the group of Americans most likely to say that character matters in a politician. That of all the groups, Muslim, Jewish, mainline, Catholic, you name it. Fast forward to early 2016, guess which group was least likely to say that character mattered in politicians? Evangelicals. The Bible didn't change in that time period. There were no revisions. There's no extra appendices, nothing like that, right? And so I was mystified by this and very resistant to it. And then when I became more resistant when I began to see the cruelty, including the cruelty from fellow members of my church that turned towards me, turned towards my family, that I was seen as a Benedict Arnold, that I was seen as destroying America. I was seen as becoming a baby killer. All of this. And so two things happened at once. One was I was exposed to extraordinary hypocrisy, and I didn't want any part of it. I couldn't look at myself in the mirror if I participated in that hypocrisy. And then I began to see a side of the evangelical political movement I'd not seen because I was inside it. And people liked me in there because I was defending religious liberty. I was a pro-life attorney. So when I would walk into churches, I was love-bombed. But I began to see what other people saw, which is when they ran afoul or when they ran across political Christianity, they confronted cruelty, they confronted threats, they confronted all kinds of hostility. And so all of a sudden, it was as if sort of the scales fell from my eyes, and I realized this community that was very loving towards members within it was very hostile to people outside. And that was, again, very contradictory to the example of Jesus, in my view. Mm-hmm. And so I stood against that. I'm not going to say I did it perfectly. I'm a flawed person. I did my best. And the blowback was horrific, and it continues to be horrific because what has happened is the church in particular has begun to make it's the political side of American Christianity into not a side thing, but a main thing. And so I wrote something. I'm not going to be getting into partisan politics tonight, but I did write something before the election where I said I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris. And one of the reasons was I wanted to save conservatism. And people thought that was bizarre. But my position was, so long as MAGA is ascendant, conservatism, as I understand it, will diminish. And so to preserve the conservatism that I believed in, then I was going to do something I'd never done. I had never voted for a Democrat for president, and I did. And the blowback, I was a wolf, a heretic, I'm going to hell. And I began to see that even in the Christian church, politics had become religion. And I do not claim to be a historian, but I will say that when politics becomes religion, it's awful for both. It's awful for politics and it's awful for religion, and nothing about the last 10 years has changed that assessment.
I want to talk a little bit more about the culture wars, because I think there's a lot of ways that we still think of these as sort of ongoing, decades-long struggle between left and right. There's abortion, in the time that you were sort of more of a culture warrior. There's issues where abortion and gay marriage, but now we're seeing things, it's all about trans rights or DEI policies, or how or even whether we're going to be teaching about race in schools, or allowing certain curricula to be included, or banning certain books from university libraries, et cetera. These are not our parents' culture wars. And I think it seems that there's big differences both in the issues and then also in the alliances. So I'd like to get your take on this. 20, 30 years ago is just different in the sense that, not like, or different than today, because like today, you don't have abortion rights, gay rights, et cetera. On abortion rights, let me say this again. Unlike abortion rights or gay rights, the right, including the administration, is supporting actively suppressing history, right? Using grievances about DEI to dismantle or attack entire institutions outright, universities, for example, law firms, media outlets. All of this is sort of effort to redefine what conservatism is as loyalty to Trump, right? But then you have also these interesting political alliances. So Liz Cheney and campaigning with Kamala Harris, or David French making a vigorous common cause with Masha Gessen, right? So it seems like the really important divide now is over democratic norms and some kind of commitment to truth, to fact, to history, whatever it might be. Would you agree with that? And I'd also be very interested to hear your thoughts on where and how religious actors, institutions fit into that picture.
Yeah, I would say a lot of our conflicts now are not just about democracy and truth, but democracy, truth, and grace, or democracy, truth, and kindness. In other words, human fellowship. And here's the reason I say that. And by the way, one thing I will say, we do not have your father's culture war, we have your grandfather's now, because we're coming back to the racial conflicts that in many ways we had thought we were moving. We had never reached a point where like things were all great. No, we were never there, but were we progressing or are we regressing? And we're definitely regressing now. So, the DEI stuff, I have been a critic of elements of the DEI infrastructure, such as when speech codes were created in law schools. However good your motive, or however pure your motives are about diversity, equity, and inclusion, you cannot use those pure motives to violate civil liberties. And so I was always critical of when DEI efforts went so far that they violated civil liberties, but I was never critical of the effort to increase diversity for more fairness, for more inclusion in this country. Those are good values. What I began to see, and I had thoughts, I had long thought that there was a lot of agreement between right and left that we wanted more racial inclusion, we wanted more racial reconciliation, we wanted more racial justice, but we disagreed on how to get there. I don't have that view anymore. I view that there are certainly people on the right and left who have that shared view, but also now know that far more people than I suspected have no interest and are actually hostile to any positive effort of any kind, whether not just affirmative action, race-based affirmative action, but any effort of any kind to foster more diversity, to be more inclusive. And so that, I think, that's when I say that's like their grandfather's culture war. But I've made so many good new friends over the last 10 years. And one of my very good new friends, he's about as left on issues that I am traditionally conservative on. And we're just the best of friends. And I said, you know what, Ian, you know how I'll know we've won and American democracy is safe? And he said, how? I said, when we stop agreeing so much and we like argue over like a new gun law or something like that, that will be like nature is healing. But right now, a lot of us who have previously been in struggles and conflicts with each other are now rowing absolutely in the same direction because we believe in American pluralism. We want greater American justice and racial reconciliation. We believe in basic human kindness and loving your neighbor and loving your neighbor as yourself. We believe in these very basic fundamental values, and that is far more important than our downline departure on any given specific issue. And so there are a lot of relationships and friendships being spawned right now across ideological divides because of this common perception that in many ways, I think in this country, human kindness itself is under attack. It's definitely on social media, absolutely increasing in real life. I was even the subject of an attack in 2019. There was an essay, very subtle title, called Against David Frenchism. I wasn't sure what he was getting at, but one of the things that he attacked me for, this was written by a guy named Sohrab Ahmari, who at the time was the editorial page editor of the New York Post. And one of the things he went after me for was that he believed I was too kind, I was too decent. And he said decency and civility are second-order values. Second-order values. And I began to see this radiating in church as well. My very dear friend Russell Moore and another dear friend named Curtis Chang, the three of us put together a curriculum for Christian churches, a new curriculum for Christian political engagement. And one of the things that we said is, for a long time, Christian politics has been sidetracked by constantly saying, God wants you to support this tax rate or this foreign policy or this approach to this, when the New Testament in particular is very silent on policy. Like, you can read the thing, you can memorize it, and you won't know how many people to bring into the southern border, right? You won't know what the capital gains tax rate should be. But one thing that is absolutely clear when you read it is that we are to love our enemies. We are to bless those who persecute us. The fruit of the Spirit is not republicanism, patriarchy, and Donald Trump, MAGA. The fruit of the Spirit is kindness, peace, patience, gentleness, self-control. So what we talked about in this curriculum was, look, whatever your policy outcome is, one thing that is absolutely clear from Scripture is you're to treat people with kindness and grace. And we centered it around this verse in the Old Testament, Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? It is to act justly. So you can't forsake justice to be the nicest person in the room. As much as, some of us are people pleasers. We'll let a lot of bad stuff happen just so people like us. Nope. You got to stand up against injustice. But some of us who stand up against injustice get very self-righteous, right? And so you have to temper your stand for justice with kindness. And then the last one is often the hardest of all. Humility. We tend to think we know more than we know. So when we were walking through this, act justly, love, kindness, walk humbly, or a verse like from 2 Timothy, what God did not give you a spirit of fear, but of power, not earthly power, but confidence in the power of God, power, love, and here's a key one for now, sound mind, okay? So this is what these are the qualities we're supposed to possess. And what's wild is I would bring this up, we would address this, and their first response, time and time again, would be, what if it doesn't work? What do you mean? What do you mean it doesn't work? No, regardless of whether we win or lose politically, kindness is not an option. It's a command. Regardless of whether we win or lose politically, humility is not just optional, it's a command. And so we are trying to make this point, and time again, another story my friend Russell tells is Baptist pastor gives a sermon on the Beatitudes. Guy comes up and he says, "Why are you sharing those liberal talking points?" And he's like, "They're not liberal talking points. These are the words of Jesus in Matthew 5. And he says, "Well, that was fine then." And here's what Russell says. I'm going to steal his response. His response was, "What does he think? That Jesus came to Mayberry? Like, this is oppression. Oppression that Jesus came to a land that was under oppression that we can't fathom." When the Apostle Paul is writing about kindness and peace and patience and gentleness, he's writing to a church that was facing deadly persecution. They would look at, let's take a median first century Christian, Theophilus. Let's just exhume Theophilus from the grave. And he's standing there and we go, "You think you had it rough, Theophilus. I know your arm is missing from that lion, but have I told you about cancel culture?" That would be their best day if the only thing they had to worry about is people, canceling them online. And so we have this world in which there's been a sense of persecution, a wrongful sense of persecution, escalating paranoia, and then an ends justifies the means ethos that is even working into the church itself. And so when that happens, yes, if you find somebody who is committed to American pluralism, if you find somebody who's committed to telling the truth, if you find someone who has basic kindness and grace towards their fellow human being, you're going to flock to them. And the one silver lining in this moment is a lot of those communities are building up around this country. I know wherever I go around the country, I meet people who are from the right and from the left who have formed new friendships, new relationships, new organizations, new fellowships, and at a grassroots level, some of the best people I know in life are working hard to heal this country. It's very hard to see it. Because from the very top, it doesn't look like that. But at the grassroots, there are a ton of people. I would guarantee you in this room, there are probably people who disagree on a lot of issues. But your primary motivation, unless you've come to heckle, which is a possibility, but you might be motivated. One of your key motivations to be here is, what can we do? What can we do about this moment? And that is something. There's a difference between hope and optimism. I'm not necessarily not super optimistic in the short to medium term, but I do have hope, and that's one of the reasons.
I just want to ask a quick follow-up that's also sort of a lead into another question. You talk about being so surprised, incredulous that your spiritual peers in your church were all for Trump when he walked down the escalator, and you're thinking, really? Really? And then everything you heard for the next 10 years confirmed that this was true, that they were actually more interested in Trump than in being the kinds of Christians that you thought they were, that you hoped to be. So were these, was this sort of animosity, do you think, was it just always simmering under the surface and Trump gave it permission to be expressed, or was something new happening?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes to both. So in a healthy political environment, he comes down the escalator and then he turns right back and goes back up because he has no market, right? He comes down. So we have already had a very unhealthy political environment. So in 2014, the Pew Research Center put out some research on polarization. And they found that, so this is 2014, 1 year before Trump comes down the escalator. They asked Republicans and Democrats, they said, do you strongly dislike, somewhat like, or strongly like people on the other side? And so 82% of Republicans in 2014 said they either strongly dislike Democrats or somewhat dislike Democrats. 82%. Democrats were, as fitting their reputation, more tolerant. Only 79% of them strongly disliked or somewhat disliked Republicans. So we had already pre-existing animosity. And so the way I've talked about the phenomenon of the last 10 years is you look at some of these political figures, not just Trump, but he's the principal one. But you look at a number of these political figures, and they're like a symptom that makes the disease worse. Like if you have a disease that gives you a hacking cough and you cough so much you break a rib, that's what we're dealing with. So if you look at some of the same numbers now, the hatred has only increased and it's become more specific. So it used to be, I just generally don't like you if you're a Democrat or Republican, whatever's on the other side. But now it's like specifically 85 to 87% of Republicans think Democrats are bigots and vice versa. It's remarkable. The two sides feel almost identically about each other. And so against this backdrop of raw animosity, that huge sense of hatred, what I have found, I've been a civil liberties lawyer, free speech lawyer my entire career. 25 years ago, it was a lot easier to convince someone to protect the free speech rights of people they disagree with. Right now, it is extremely difficult. And it is very difficult to protect liberty in an atmosphere of raw animosity. But one of my own views is that it's the actual protection of liberty, including the liberty of people I disagree with, that is one of the things that's going to actually heal this country. Because I know for myself, I have represented people I profoundly disagree with, but the fact that I was in the foxhole with them when their rights were threatened bonded us. It bonded us together, sometimes to form lifelong friendships. And I've learned from the people I disagree with. And some of the people I disagree with have maybe learned a thing or two from me as well. But I feel like that defense of civil liberties that says we're all equal in the eyes of the law. And so if I disagree with you or I agree with you, I will defend you with equal intensity, is very countercultural to the moment. It's extremely countercultural to the moment, but I think it's indispensable for preserving our American Republic.
Yeah, I want to talk for a minute about the moment. You wrote in February that Trump is damaging American democracy, diminishing American power, and destroying American alliances with an energy and an efficiency that must exceed the wildest dreams of our enemy. That's a David
Other than
French
that,
quote.
things are fine.
Things are fine. This was more than a month ago, so it's gotten worse. And yet, for many Americans, the extent of the damage simply doesn't register, right?
Yeah.
Either because they're not paying attention, because they lack historical context for what's happening, or because they receive information that from sources that are reluctant to portray Trump as a danger to democracy, and not just Joe Rogan and Fox News, right? You've also made the point that we are, again, I'm quoting David French, the most comprehensively, voluntarily, and cooperatively misinformed generation of people ever to walk the earth. That is, that we are complicit in our own misinformation. And you say we're misinformed not because government is systematically lying or suppressing the truth, although I would say yes, they are. We're misinformed because we like the misinformation we receive, and we are eager for more. So I want you to talk about this for a little bit, and then maybe help us, given the media landscape that we have, where our thirst for misinformation is slaked instantly, where and how do we create forums for honest appraisals of and responses to the damage that we're witnessing?
When I was researching my book, one of the most powerful conversations that I had was with somebody who is an expert in identity-based conflict. And they're talking about and talking through how difficult, once someone locks in a partisan way, not that they have leanings, right, but they're locked in on a partisan position that becomes part of their identity. In other words, if you're listing your characteristics, like what are your immutable characteristics, and you list your political identity, like at that equivalent level, when you're locked in, she said something fascinating. She said that people who are locked in on partisanship, when they hear a negative fact, not a negative argument, okay, not a negative argument, a negative fact. Like here would be a negative fact for some hardcore MAGA people in December 2020. Italian military satellites are incapable of disrupting American voting machines. That's a fact, okay? It also disrupted a conspiracy theory. And so what they found was if you are locked in as a partisan and you encounter a conspiracy theory, or you're locked in as a partisan, you encounter a negative fact, it triggers a fight or flight response, that you have an involuntary negative emotional reaction to hearing a negative fact. And that, I thought for a moment, wow, that explains a lot. We are pain avoiders. We are pleasure seekers, sort of as a matter of default. And so if you're a pain avoider, you're going to be seeking out and looking towards those news outlets, and those people are going to be pinging those pleasure centers in your brain. And this is all very, very visceral and very basic. And so, and I've seen it in my own life, and I guarantee now that I've told you this, you'll see it too. You'll watch somebody, maybe you're talking to somebody who's even a good friend, but if they're really locked in a partisan way and you bring up something that's a negative fact, you'll see them tense. You'll watch something change in their face, and it's almost, it's involuntary, that they're so locked in that it's now involuntary. And so that makes it very difficult. It makes it very difficult for the truth to enter the equation. That's one of the reasons why you can't fact check people out of their conspiracy theories. It's not like someone who's really into conspiracy theories is going, well, I'm absolutely convinced that there is a gang of pedophiles who's running America and interfering with elections. But if you can show me something from PolitiFact to contradict that, I'm with you. No. People are very, very deeply invested. And then the other thing that makes them even more invested is they form communities of like-minded individuals. And so what then begins to happen is once you've formed this community of like-minded individuals, compliance with the consensus of the community becomes a precondition to your social flourishing, to your community, to your life. And so one of the best things that we published at the Dispatch before I went to the Times was by my former colleague, Andrew Egger, and he embedded himself with the front row Joes. These were the people who go to every Trump rally like they're following the Grateful Dead, right? And what he found was they initially went for Trump and they stayed for each other because they formed a community. You cannot understand what's happening in this country without understanding people's thirst and hunger for community. There is a great body of research into America's sense of belonging created by the National Immigration Council and a group called Over Zero, and they created a belonging index. And what they found was about 2/3 of Americans feel a strong sense of non-belonging in one or more key areas: friendships, family, community, workplace. And what they found was the more a person experiences a sense of non-belonging and isolation, the more they're attracted to extremism and anger. And so a lot of this extremism and anger that we're seeing and experiencing in our lives is not actually the product of a rational thought process that says, I have studied the issues and I have concluded X or Y. It's a product of loneliness, of alienation, of creating cause-based communities that are very narrow and limited to, I get to be friends with you only so long as I agree with you. And when you begin to understand that reality, two things happen at once. One, it actually makes you more nervous about our country because you realize, whoa, we have to pull people out of community relationships here. And also, but at the other hand, it also at least makes me more compassionate. Because what I'm realizing is that I'm not interacting often with people who are malicious. I'm interacting with people who are lonely. I'm interacting with people who lack community. I'm interacting with people who are trying to find meaning and purpose in their lives and finding it in misplaced areas. And so when you accurately diagnose that, you can begin to accurately treat it. And so I'll give you a great example from a lot of families. I'm sure there are families in here that have been divided by politics. And, so one of my very dear friends, his mother became extremely focused on every MAGA conspiracy theory, everything regarding Trump, to the point where it's very difficult to continue a relationship. And then in despair, he heard her say, this is music to my ears because I love basketball. He heard her say, that Ja Morant is fun to watch. Memphis Grizzlies guard, most exciting young player in the NBA. And he thought, boom, hey, Mom, when the Grizzlies play, come over to the house. And so he just invited her over every Grizzlies game, 82 games a year plus playoffs. And they just sat and talked basketball. And then it turned into basketball in life and basketball in the grandchild and basketball in and it healed that relationship, and didn't mean that like she abandoned the GOP or whatever. It just meant that the temperature got turned down a great deal. Hearts opened, minds opened. And this is so important. If you take nothing away from this, anything that I say, take this away from what Jonathan Haidt has said. A lot of you might know who he is, NYU sociologist, probably the leading warrior against smartphones in all of the world now. But he wrote a book years ago, and he talked about the process of persuasion like this. He said, think of a human being as an elephant and a rider. The rider is our rational mind. It's the part that says 2 + 2 = 4, 3 + 3 = 6. The Southeastern Conference is the best football conference. All of these like facts, right? And he said that's the rider. The elephant is everything else. It's our upbringing. It's our ethnicity. It's our faith. It's the geography of where we lived. All of these things. And he said, look at it like this: if everyone talks to the rider, but if you can reach the rider, but the elephant doesn't want to move, rider ain't going anywhere. But if you speak to the elephant and the elephant wants to move, rider is coming along. And it's interesting, if you're in the business of persuasion, you get that kind of instinctively. When I was a trial lawyer back in the day, one of my first priorities was to soften the heart of the jury towards my client. And then I give them all the rational reasons why that's the right thing to do, right? I backfill the rationality and the reason. But the first thing I tried to do was lead with the heart. You see this on commercials, right? I mean, take your average pharmaceutical commercial. Very healthy, active, wonderful people who are overcoming the greatest challenges in the history of the world. And oh, by the way, the side effect is your arm might fall off. But so you're leading with this, reaching people in their heart. And if you do it in the right way, it's not manipulation. And the right way is when you reach a heart, but you also fill the mind. If you only go for the heart, that's what I think of as manipulation. So I tend to think of persuasion as happening in 3 stages. Affection, try to connect with a person. Show them that you like them, that you care for them. Then connection. Where is it that you have a common bond? Where is it you have a common interest? And then you move to reason. So it's the affection and the connection that open the heart. And when you open the heart, you open the mind, and that's when you pursue reason. And so that is a person-by-person process. That is a hard and long process. It's sometimes a years-long process. But the fact of the matter is, unless we try to reach people where they are in the lives that they're living from a posture of affection, seeking connection, I think we're going to be lost.
Thanks. I'm glad you talked about experience of in the courtroom. I want to raise a question about that. I'm going to take as a given the idea that that conservatism that you know and you understand is not what we see. So another term that's sometimes used is the new right. So the new right has aggressively attacked institutions that are committed to truth-keeping or to truth-telling standards, whether it's academia, law, courts, journalism, etc. So you're a journalist and an attorney. I want to get you to talk a little bit about the courts, which are one of the places where there are very strict rules about truth-telling and lying and things. And we've seen how courts can vindicate the truth in some pretty important cases involving insurrectionists like Stewart Rhodes, former Trump lawyers who were involved in the big lie. Even Fox News came clean and said, we're not news. People don't think that we're actually telling you news, so that's an unreasonable expectation. We can be forgiven for these things. But we've also seen the limitations of the courts in the refusal to indict or to let juries or trials go through for Trump. And also, most recently, we've seen some pretty virulent attacks on the courts and on judges and on law institutions. And so feel free to say a few words about that, but I also want to ask you, what happens if or when the administration ignores court rulings, particularly the Supreme Court ruling?
Yeah, wow, there's a lot there. The first thing I'll say is I truly believe the judiciary is our best functioning branch of government. By best functioning, I do not mean perfect. I strongly disagreed with the immunity ruling, but we cannot, the judgment of the legitimacy of a court is not whether you agree with all its rulings. That is not the measure of legitimacy. You can strongly disagree, and a judge can still have integrity. I understood the reasons why the court made the ruling that it did. I strongly disagreed with those reasons. But the main reason why Trump was never tried prior to the election had nothing to do with the immunity case. It had everything to do with how late the case was brought. Because everybody knew that he was going to appeal to the Supreme Court over an immunity issue, and that immunity ruling did not end his case. There was a lot of stuff left there to prosecute him for. What ended his case was he won the presidency. And so I think we sometimes overblame the court here. But what I would say is, here, I'm going to say some things I hope will reassure you to a degree before I alarm you. So I know a lot of the judges in the judiciary, not giant numbers, but I know a lot of judges. And I will say that as a group, there are a couple of things about them that distinguish them from members of Congress. One is, to a man and woman, every last judge I know, federal district court, federal appellate court, Supreme Court, they're wickedly smart. I just have never met a dumb federal judge, okay? Just not seen it. And then number two is they are far more independent than people tend to realize. They're not people who are prone to being intimidated. So for example, there's a lot of MAGA world that is coming after Amy Coney Barrett right now. Good luck with that. Good luck with that. So a lot of these judges are very smart and they're very independent. Unlike members of Congress, they don't have to face primary voters, for example. And so that's why if you went back and you looked at the Trump election challenge, he did not win a single case in front of a judge he appointed. Not one. One of the reasons why MAGA is very upset at Amy Coney Barrett and has complained about Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch is they did not back him in the election challenge. A lot of people just read very quick headlines in the Supreme Court's recent decision involving the Alien Enemies Act. The Supreme Court ripped the legs out from under the Trump administration on the Aliens Enemies Act. And they did it in such a way, with such jujitsu, that weirdly enough, MAGA was celebrating the outcome. And I'm like, you didn't read this decision. All 9 justices said, you have to give these guys due process in federal court before they're deported. And when you give them due process, they're entitled to challenge whether the Alien Enemies Act even applies. And since, what did we see today? 2 judges in different parts of the country blocked deportations under the Alien Enemies Act, relying on that Supreme Court case. That's jujitsu. He got MAGA to celebrate a defeat. That's pretty wild. So don't sleep on the courts. I think they have some real potential here but they cannot save us. They cannot. At the end of the day, if the American people want this kind of governance, we're going to get this kind of governance, and every guardrail in the Constitution will crumble slowly but surely. If this is what the American people want, they're going to get it. They're going to get what they want. And one of the things that drives me crazy is how Americans are constantly deflecting blame to politicians. Nobody made you vote for these people, right? No, not one of, there was no death threat to anybody to vote for these people. And so these are people that a critical mass of American people selected. Now, what happens if Trump defies the court? So here's what I think. I think the court is going to issue its rulings. I think to the extent that the court takes it into consideration, they might do it in the jujitsu way that we just dealt with, where they kind of give a little fig leaf here and then lower the hammer there. And so I think you might see some jujitsu in that way. But I expect the court will issue its rulings. The question will be, will Donald Trump comply? And I think by and large, he will. By and large, because I still think that there is a critical mass of Americans who are not willing to cross that Rubicon. But even if he doesn't issue the ruling anyway, okay, and we have historical precedent for this. It's called Brown versus Board of Education. So in 1954, the case comes before the Supreme Court of the United States. Is segregation consistent with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? And they say no. Now, did they think that the southern states were going to desegregate then? They did not. But they did not water down the ruling. They did not change the ruling. They issued the ruling. Now, for years, the southern states did not comply. For years, the federal government did not enforce compliance. We kind of forget this. It sort of gets lost in this whole sense of the civil rights movement won. But from 1954 to 1964, really 1954 till past 1964 in the Civil Rights Act, the Brown v. Board was obeyed and complied with mainly in the breach. But eventually, compliance came. And what do we end up having at the end of the day? It took 10, 15, 20 years, but we ended up with a historic Supreme Court decision and desegregation. So we have to take the longer view. That's why you issue the ruling, even if the president tries to defy it. The ruling stands, and it stands in history, and it has moral and legal force even beyond the immediate moment of the ruling. So my own sense is that the Supreme Court is going to issue its rulings. And you can go back and you can read the Republican-nominated justices, and some of their writings are very emphatic. So, for example, Brett Kavanaugh gave a speech to Notre Dame law school students not long ago where he said one underestimated element of Marbury versus Madison, this is the 1803 case that established judicial review, is that it's not just that the courts determine the legality of congressional actions, the courts are the final arbiter of presidential actions as well. So this is deeply, deeply ingrained. So I do not think the Supreme Court's going to issue all its rulings I'm going to agree with. It's not. Just prep yourself. You're going to disagree some. But the bottom line on the core fundamental elements of our Constitution, I do believe they're going to stand firm. I do believe they're going to issue the rulings that they're not going to water down their rulings to satisfy Donald Trump. And then the ball's going to be in his court. And I don't have confidence that he'll comply. I think he'll comply unless it gets to something he really, 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 really cares about. But that's the Supreme Court's role. Put the ball back in the court. We've done our job. And then they do have tools that they can utilize that can be more effective than just a piece of paper, issuing a piece of paper. But I don't think the judiciary can save us, but I do think it's the best functioning branch of government. Many of the Trump-appointed judges, whom I know, are not going to yield to just whatever MAGA tells them to do, and they have not yielded to just whatever MAGA tells them to do. And so I do think there's a lot of reason to believe that one of our branches is still carrying that Madisonian flag. Don't ask me about Congress. Oh man. Everything good I just said, just reverse it. Yeah, for Congress.
Thank you for reminding us what the courts can and can't do. So I want to look beyond the courts for a minute. You've made the point very strongly that you disagree profoundly with the tenor of pro-Palestinian protests on the Columbia University campus and elsewhere. You've also dissented forcefully from the Trump administration's actions in response to protests at Columbia, including the deportation of former student Mohammed Khalil, a permanent U.S. resident. And you've sharply criticized Columbia for ceding to the administration's demands, right? More recently, you suggested, quote, the only things preventing America from sliding into violent despotism are the courage of Trump's opponents and the strength of those institutions that are willing to take a stand. And you add that you are actually more alarmed by the capitulation of so many powerful legal and academic institutions than you are by Trump's unconstitutional demands. So ASU is now on the list with Columbia of 60 universities being targeted for alleged Title VI violations. That hasn't been put on a bus yet, but I imagine it might be. We also have had students who have had their visas revoked without them even knowing it. And so they're targets now for deportation. What would you have universities like ASU do to take a stand against the administration? And how would you like to see universities and law firms respond to strong arming in general?
I mean, I think there's a very short, easy answer. Is if the administration tries to do to any institution what it tried to do to Columbia, what it tried to do to what's done to Paul Weiss, to Skadden Arps, to any number, you go to federal court. You don't go to the Oval Office. You say, you will be communicating with me through my court filings, okay? I try to be charitable. I have zero respect for any powerful institution that yields to Trump. Zero. I have negative respect. Because you know what? I know people, individuals, just folks, who have stood up to him and endured hell on earth, and billion-dollar institutions won't use a fraction of their resources to resist an unconstitutional attack on their fundamental rights. Spare me. You guys live, is this Maricopa County?
It is.
Okay. You guys know Stephen Richer?
Yep.
Okay. Stephen's he's just a dude, right? He's just a guy who did his job the right way with integrity and has faced hell on earth every day ever since the 2020 election. And then you go around and you say, and Paul Weiss, one of the most powerful law firms in the world, goes hat in hand to the president. Skadden Arps goes hat in hand. Columbia University goes hat in hand. No, and I have serious disagreements with the way Columbia handled the situation with the protests last year. But Columbia, when the Trump administration took action against Columbia, it clearly violated the law. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has procedures in place if you want to remove federal funding. That means you have to demonstrate that there is no voluntary compliance. You have to have a hearing in federal court. And then only after a hearing in federal court and a finding of a violation of a formal finding of a Title VI violation can you start to remove that funding under Title VI. Trump administration just skipped all that. It went straight to we're cutting it off. So even if Columbia has made big mistakes, which it has, Trump administration violated its rights. Now here's the darkest timeline here, which is there are some speculation as to whether or not Columbia kind of used the Trump administration as the sword of Damocles over its head to kind of justify what it wanted to do anyway, if that makes sense. That's a possibility. I don't know. But I do know that this capitulation is absolutely more damaging than the attack itself. Absolutely. Because the reason we have the system that we have is because we anticipate the exact attacks that we're receiving. Go back to Federalist 51. And James Madison acknowledging that angels do not govern us. So why do we have these systems? And so if this is not angelic governance, this is not what angelic governance looks like, we have systems to deal with that. And if you're voluntarily refusing to take advantage of the systems that exist, and you have all of the power and money to be able to do it, and look, I'm not going to say it'd be easy for Paul Weiss. The chairman of the firm put out a statement that said, already other law firms were trying to poach our clients and poach our attorneys. So I have sympathy for the plight that they're in, but they need to stand and not yield. And I have utter contempt for the law firms that were trying to take advantage of Paul Weiss's predicament. That's how republics fall. Republics fall when your fellow citizens look at your misfortune as an opportunity and not as an injustice. That's when we fall.
We are going to go to audience Q&A now. We're going to queue on up over here. And I ask that you, if you have a brief question, make sure it's both brief and a question, right? We have as many more questions we can get to as possible. While folks are starting to queue up, go ahead and move on over there. If you would like someone to come to you and grab a question card or something, we can do that as well. And if you have online questions, we can do that. I just want to take one moment to summarize what I think are just three phenomenal points that I don't want us to walk away with, because everyone always says, what can we do? And the things that I've heard you say today in our conversations are have courage, have conviction, trust our institutions, and I can't read that last one there. What is it? Practice kindness and grace. And so I was taking notes even if I can't read them. So anyway, I just want to thank you for that. So with that, please let's turn to some audience Q&A. If you're not able to get up, I guess you can also raise your hand and we can bring the microphone around. So go ahead.
Hi, I wanted to start by, most of us, I hate to say this, are old in this room. I hope you younger people are listening to what you have to say, because we've got to hand the ball off to you guys. He's leaving. And then a second point, Mark Twain said, we only listen to be heard. And that's, I think, where we are now. But how do you, and I guess maybe you touched on it, the hypocrisy of saying I'm a good person and then trashing them. I mean, that I just keep seeing.
You know, one of the things that I've realized in this process, because I've been on the inside, and a lot of people are sort of on the outside of like the conservative evangelicalism, are like, David, we could see this. Why couldn't you see this? Well, you know, I was in the room with, you know, leaders of the evangelical conservative movement, and they were not going, heh, 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 we care only about character when it's Democrats. Like, they were not saying that. I think if you put them under a lie detector test before 2015, they would have said, yes, character is king. But then what happened is all of a sudden that value carried a cost. Okay, and we don't really know if we hold a value truly until we can hold it when it carries a cost. And it is the tension where we understand our true hierarchy of values. It's when they come into conflict with each other. And what we saw was that the will to power came into conflict with integrity, quite frankly, and the will to power triumphed. Now, they'll rationalize that and they'll say, no. What came in conflict was our desire to do good and right by the American people. But all of those issues are like flipping and changing and morphing. But the one thing that is staying the same is we must be in charge. And so I think for all of us, that's a very humbling thing to sort of say, okay, I have one conception of myself in my brain. And then will that be borne out when that conception is challenged? And so I do think it's a really important moment for all of us. If we want to see America be a place with more grace and with more kindness, we have to demonstrate it. If we want to be a place where the truth matters, we have to tell it, even when it hurts. And so, you know, I think that one of the reasons why a lot of younger Americans have checked out of the process or not particularly focused on the process as much as we might like is often a real lack of role models, a real lack of mentors, a real lack of leaders that they respect enough to say, to want to emulate, to follow, and perhaps even improve on. And so, one of the things when I think about what do we do going forward, I liked your 3 points to pull out. I right after the election was written, election was decided, I wrote, and I said, I have 2 priorities: tell the truth and defend the vulnerable. Those are my big priorities. Tell the truth and defend the vulnerable. If we can do that, we can get through this moment. And the last thing I would say in response is, I don't know about you guys, but I'm very family oriented. I'm very family oriented, not just with my immediate family, but I'm also very interested in my family history. And so I have this question that I often ask: what was my family doing when? What were they doing during the Revolution? They're at Valley Forge. Yay. Okay. What were they doing during the Civil War? They were at Shiloh wearing gray. Oh. Okay. So you go back and you look at this, and I think this is one of these moments where I do think that we need to think about what were our children and grandchildren and our great-grandchildren say. If they're looking back, will they find evidence that we stood? And evidence that we stood is not just, I feel bad about what's happening in here. Is there something concrete? What is it that is concrete that future generations will look back and say, my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my grandfather, they stood when it counted. And that's going to look different for different people. It depends on what position you're in life. It depends on what kind of resources you have. But my urging towards people is to do something that is so tangible it will endure. And it can be even look at all the pictures of the protests I went to, or look at the letters, the statements, the things that I wrote, or look at how they reached out to this person who was hurting. Look how they took in a visa holder who was uncertain in the moment and couldn't find a place of refuge. I mean, like, these kinds of things are the kinds of things that I think we'll need to look back on. So I totally lost track of the whole question to do my little rant. But yeah, I think if we can look at it from the standpoint of this is a moment that we need to mark in our lives of our descendants, that we stood for American pluralism, we stood for American democracy, and what that's going to look like for each of us is very variable.
All right, we have a lot of questions here, so succinctness in questions and responses will be...
I cannot be succinct in response.
You're very succinct.
I have no guarantees.
It's just, okay.
Thank you very much for this talk. This was very insightful. I think my question goes back to, I was very drawn to that point that you made, that a majority of Americans now feel alienated, alone, and that we need to find those ways to bring people in. I think my question is, how do we do that? I think very much now, particularly in MAGA spaces, in those reactionary spaces, that they're taking from the famous Andrew Breitbart quote, politics is downstream of culture. So I guess, how do we, on both sides of the aisle, how do we keep making our spaces and our activities more pluralistic and less partisan?
That's a great question. So one of the biggest issues we have in this country, this is going to sound trite and simplistic and all of this, but it's 1,000,000,000% deeply true, and that is people are lonely and do not have friends. Okay? And the number of friends that we have in this country is declining rapidly. So if you look back 30 years ago, working class Americans, people who had a high school degree or less, about 1% of them reported having no friends at all. 1%. Last year, 24% of people with a high school degree or less reported having no friends. I have a friend from my old church who owned a small manufacturing company. He had a policy where if there was a worker who had no place to be at Thanksgiving or Christmas, that they were welcome in his home. That anyone who had no family, no place to be at Thanksgiving, they could come to his house. At first, it was 1 or 2 people. Now he has to rent out restaurants. Like, I'm not even kidding. That's how much loneliness there is. So literally, one of the things that I feel like we can do is, and one of the things that actually our country is lacking a great deal, this is going to sound crazy, is cross-class friendships. Upper middle class people are friends with upper middle class people. Working class folks are friends with working class folks. So what I urge folks to do is go find ways to invest in your community where you are going to be serving and working alongside people who are different from you. And number one, you're going to learn. And number two, you're going to create relationships and friendships that you should nurture and that you should provide a lot of grace for. I'll give you an example of not long ago, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, a tornado hit Mayfield, Kentucky. That's where my wife grew up. Wiped out the town. Let's just wiped it out. And so my friends and I from college, we went up there and we volunteered as part of a cleanup crew. And that was a diverse group of people. And I met this couple. And this is what they do in their life. They're retired. This is what they do. They volunteer with a Christian relief organization, and they have an emergency radio by their bed. And when they get a word that there is a tornado or a natural disaster within about a 200-mile radius of their house, they get out of bed and they go to the disaster. They have relationships with this relief organization where they have access to tools and to networks of other people like them, and they're there almost as fast as first responders. That's what they do with their life. I like to think I'm an okay person. That makes me, I felt awful. I was just here for this weekend and I'm like, yay me, But so we're talking, and I'm just really vibing with them and just really enjoying the conversation. And at one point, the wife says to me, "You know why this is happening, these tornadoes, don't you?" And I said, "No." I said, "It's Biden's punishing the red states." And so, what do you do? What do you do, right? Do you say, "Well, this was almost a beautiful friendship"? I say no. I say no. I say, in that moment, I just said, I don't really think that's possible. But then I said, "Oh, hey, could you hand me this?" I just went right past it, right? And I do think that is, again, this sounds sort of, excessively simplistic. But if a lot of the anger in our politics is related to loneliness and alienation, be part of that solution. And if a lot of the despair is related to the loss of cross-class friendships, then, and by the way, one of the things that improves income mobility almost more than anything else is having friends, if you're working class and you have friends who are like middle class, upper middle class. It's an engine of social mobility. It's an engine of social peace. And by the way, it's an engine of joy and fulfillment to intentionally form relationships. So that's one thing that I would urge. That's what, and again, make a friend sounds like almost like Sunday, like vacation Bible school, like, okay, kids, go. It's Mr. Rogers, but we need Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers was awesome. Like, nobody should make fun of Mr. Rogers, right? And so I do think that is an indispensable element of the solution, and it's something that at the micro level is within all of our grasps.
Thank you very much.
So I'm going to suggest we get a couple of questions into the ether here, and you can try to maybe, if they come together, great, or pick different elements to speak. So let's get maybe 3 questions in there.
Oh, so I'll try and make this as succinct as possible. So you've addressed a lot of things in terms of like the culture war and things that in terms of addressing would probably take at least a few years. In light of everything that's going on right now and Project 2025, I was wondering, how do you think it's possible to both stand up and to protest, but also to make a difference at the same time? And just tying into that, what if he tries to invoke martial law?
So, can I grab? Thanks. Thanks for the great conversation, also for the great writing that you've done, especially recently, which at least for me has been a source of comfort and respite. So you've mentioned pluralism repeatedly. I just want to ask you to elaborate a little bit on what you understand pluralism to mean, and particularly in terms of the kind of democratic institutions that underwrite it. The framing of this panel was the sort of post-truth, politics of post-truth. But it seems to me one can understand the politics of post-truth as really an intensification of the politics of truth, because one person's truth is another person's conspiracy theory. And it's really about the question of where one looks in human institutions, which is to say in political institutions, to find that place of overlapping consensus. And so much of liberal theory has been built around the presumption that that just sort of happens, that it's reason to connection to affection and not the other way around. So I wonder if you would say something about what we should learn from the last 20 years or so of politics about pluralism and what sorts of transformations of democratic institutions it requires.
So I'll go first question, then second question. So first question, I think, is a really good question about, okay, what if, in essence, what if things keep escalating? Like, what if we do get to the invocation of the Insurrection Act? And you've heard me a number of times today refer to the civil rights movement. I think that's our model, okay? I think that's our model in multiple directions. So one of the core elements of the civil rights movement was really love in the face of hatred. So that we've talked about the elements of kindness and grace as a balm to our souls. You know, the Black Americans in the Jim Crow South had reason for utter rage. Utter rage, okay? Whatever situation any American community is in right now, and a number of American communities are in a much tougher position than they were 3 months ago. They're not in the position that folks were in the Jim Crow South. So utter rage would be absolutely justified. But then what happens if you read King's writings, the philosophy of nonviolence, the quest for reconciliation, love in the face of hatred? So that's an ethos of the civil rights movement that I think is absolutely should be adopted. And the second thing is the courage. And so what was that courage? How is it manifested? Well, at sometimes massive, peaceful civil disobedience. Okay? And we have to be very careful. That's not the same thing as massive law breaking, because civil disobedience at its best respects the rule of law, because you break the law, but you absorb the penalty for breaking the law. But massive, peaceful civil disobedience. So what should happen if there's an Insurrection Act invocation? You know, I would hope and pray for 2 million people in the streets. Peaceful. Arrest us all. Can't hold us all. But that, I think that if you look at that civil rights movement as a model, because nobody can sit here and say that Martin Luther King was insufficiently committed to the cause of justice. Nobody can say that. But he did it in a way that made healing and reconciliation possible. And he did it in a way that exhibited ultimate courage. So that, you know, I was talking at our little dinner beforehand that there are some people who are unpersuadable, right? There are some people, their hearts are dark and cold and they're just unpersuadable. And we tend to focus mainly on those folks because they're the loudest. You hear them all the time. But there's a vast cloud of witnesses who are persuadable, who are reachable. And they're watching both sides and they're seeing who is reasonable, who is not reasonable, who has compassion, who does not have compassion, who is honest, who is not honest. And, you know, the way I look at it is the process of persuasion. Part of reaching the elephant, I really like this illustration that a colleague of mine uses where he says, persuasion is about creating on-ramps instead of speed bumps. How can I make it easy to get off that MAGA interstate and on pluralism road? You know? And so that, I think that's absolutely key. Now, back to the question about pluralism in liberal theory. I think one of the interesting elements of the founders' theory of pluralism is I think that they were very aware that pluralism in many ways contradicts our human nature. We are not naturally inclined towards protecting the liberty of people we disagree with. We are much more naturally inclined towards that will to power. That, you know, when you're part of the MAGA ethos is you see it reflected in the writings of Carl Schmitt, who is a German, later Nazi philosopher in the 1930s, who coined the term the friend-enemy distinction. He said that's the key element of politics is the friend-enemy distinction. And if you are not entering into politics with the friend-enemy distinction, you're just playing the wrong game, man, because politics is friend-enemy. Well, the founders more than 100 years before Carl Schmitt knew about this kind of phenomenon, and they tried to create a holistic ethos, and they were not, a lot of hypocrisy there. You had slave-owning founders, remember? But what they tried to do is create an ethos that was a social compact that went like this. It was the obligation of government to protect liberty. That's the sentence right after we're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's the responsibility of governments. Governments were instituted amongst men, not solely to protect liberty, but to protect liberty. And then John Adams writes this letter to the Massachusetts militia in 1800, and he says, this Constitution, in essence, I would urge you to read the whole letter. It's pretty short. But the basic thesis of it was our constitutional republic depends on virtue. That in the absence of virtue, vices like ambition, greed, avarice, etc., and he uses this memorable phrase, will cut through the cords of our Constitution the way a whale goes through a net. And my colleague Jeff Rosen, who runs the National Constitution Center, friend Jeff Rosen, runs the National Constitution Center, wrote a book called The Pursuit of Happiness, which I would also highly recommend. And he talks about that in the founding generation, the pursuit of happiness was not the pursuit of the good life in the sense of pleasure. It was the pursuit of being good. And I think that's how the social compact works. The government should defend our liberty, and it's our responsibility to exercise our liberty for a virtuous purpose. And that's the system. That's how we're created. And the problem with spreading the gospel of pluralism is that pluralism is constantly mischaracterized. People who have that will to power scorn pluralism as weakness and moral relativism. It's the opposite of that. Pluralism requires courage and conviction, and pluralism at its best protects the existence of many communities of conviction. It's not moral relativism. Pluralism protects our ability to hold our convictions and live side by side peacefully with people who hold competing convictions. That's not moral relativism. And so I think we have to accurately describe what it is. And we have to actually accurately describe the stakes. This country is too diverse. It has too many different competing value systems for one value system to win and suppress all the others. In a very real way, our option is pluralism or civil war. It just is. It just is. We're not like a country, like many European countries that are rooted in particular blood and soil and faith. If you talked about blood and soil citizenship in the U.S., it'd be like, whose blood, which soil? Like, this is just too big and diverse a place. So pluralism, we have to talk about it as what it is a necessity. It's a necessity for each of us to flourish in this country. We give it up, and that will end in tears.
Okay, I've got three of my former students here. These are going to be the last questions. I'm going to ask you to, if you would, please get them all out into the air. I could not forgive myself, though, if I didn't get these questions here. So please, Corinne.
I want to say thank you for your talk, and I appreciate that you gave us tangible things to do, like go make friends, be kind to people with different political opinions. I think that's very important when you talk about these really daunting topics, to think about what to do next. And I wanted to ask, you talk about people are drawn to extreme politics or conspiracy theories because they don't have community. But at the same time, a source of community, religion, people are not attending religious spaces as often. There's a lot of unaligned people. And also, like you said, sometimes religious spaces are pushing untruths and political polarization. So I want to ask, are there secular or just kind of any organizations of community that you see that people can go to that exist? And kind of what do you suggest for creating community that's not religious or political?
Yeah,
Great. Can we get the next two as well, and then we'll.
I'm so ready for that question.
I know, I'm good. No, that's great. It's great. We love it. I love it. So, Albertine.
Hi. Well, this actually isn't my question. It's a question from online. So sorry to disappoint. It says, I am a member of Mormon Women for Ethical Government, and we are huge fans of yours.
I know the founder. She's awesome. Yeah.
Cool. I hadn't heard of the group.
They're dynamite, by the way.
This is answering the first question, right? Maybe? Okay. So.
It says, can you talk about what it means to be a peacemaker in civil society today? What characteristics should we focus on?
Okay. And Mia?
Similarly to Albertine, mine is an online question, so I will be reading that off. It says, exactly 40 years ago, this month, thousands of radio stations across the United States simultaneously played a song sung by a chorus of famous singers. It was called We Are the World, and one of its principal purposes was to motivate citizens of all faiths, backgrounds, and policies to support famine relief in Ethiopia. And over ensuing decades, it became an anthem for efforts to bring people of different faiths, backgrounds, and status together in a common purpose. Today, the U.S. and potentially in other countries, do you think we may need another We Are the World moment, but this time also led by artists rather than politicians?
Oh, that's a great question. I would never sleep on the power of art. But the interesting thing about the power of art is it's hard to do it as a plan. What really captures people is so unpredictable. But can I share something with you that I think is actually stirring in the world of art that is incredibly encouraging to me? Do y'all remember when Ted Lasso hit a moment? Okay, do you remember the moment, like the key moment when Ted Lasso really hit a moment was when Rebecca, and I'm going back to season 1. If you haven't watched it, I'm gonna spoil something here, but you've had ample opportunity to watch this show, okay? So at the middle, towards the end of season 1, this this football coach was brought to Britain to fail as a soccer coach. And lo and behold, it's a funny, silly concept for a show. It's hilarious. But at some point, it's coming that the owner of the soccer club is going to confess to Ted that he was a pawn in a game, that this was not a real thing. And she feels very badly because she's grown to love him and have affection for him. And so she confesses, right? And there's this pattern we all have in rom-coms or whatever, that you have the confession, you have the break in the relationship, and then eventually by the season's end, they get back together. This is a pattern. So I'm like bracing myself for the break, the fracture. Instead, Ted says, I forgive you. Divorce is hard. That was what he said. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and expose myself as a total sap. When he did that, I literally had tears in my eyes, because what it was showing and what happened was there's this power of forgiveness that really radiated out into the culture. And I'm beginning to see this in more and more shows, because, and I'm not going to spoil this one because the season 2 is just fresh, but there's a moment in the Apple TV series Shrinking that my wife and youngest daughter were watching the very end of the season 2 finale, and they're like, that was touching. And then they looked over at me and I'm bawling. I'm like a baby. But what I was seeing was this portrayals of forgiveness. And that is a lost value. That is a lost value. And it is a value that is very hard to teach intellectually. But when you see it demonstrated even fictionally, it has this enormous power. So I'm not sleeping on pop culture at all. I just think that often pop culture can manifest itself and it can do things in unpredictable ways that can be powerful. And so I say, keep your eyes peeled, because there's a lot of people right now who are making art for this moment. And some of it is going to catch on. Some of it is very powerful. So that's one. Go back to the question that I was about jumping out of my chair with the starter's pistol to answer. What kind of organizations should we be looking to join? And I'm not gonna tell you a list, but I'm gonna give you a characteristic. Look for organizations where people have diverse perspectives. Look for organizations, including churches. Not all churches are monocultures. Look for places that have diverse perspectives. A couple of reasons for this. One is you're going to learn a lot. It's going to change you. It's going to shape you. It's going to impact you in a positive way if you walk in there with an open heart. So it's going to make you better. The other thing that organizations with diverse perspectives are able to do is they're able to resist a phenomenon that is ripping us to pieces, and it's called the law of group polarization. So the law of group polarization comes from Cass Sunstein article, 1999, a law review article he wrote a long time ago. And I'm just the nerd to read a law review article from 1999, but it is so powerfully true. And what he collects social science, and he says, here is a characteristic of human beings. When like-minded people gather, we become more extreme. And so one of the things that's happening is we're in the middle of what's called the big sort, right? So people are now migrating for ideological reasons to be around like-minded people. And so we wonder why the polar opposites in this country are growing larger and larger. We used to have a bell curve of American ideology where you had the small groups on the left and the small groups on the right and this big American middle. That's going from a bell curve to almost like a valley. It's not all the way there yet, but we now have a big far left and we have a big far right, and they live piled on top of each other in monoculture communities. So my community is very red. There's a tool at the New York Times where you can put in your address and you can find out what the voting composition in your neighborhood is. Mine's 85% Republican. So that is one of my favorite critiques that I get. It's like, you're at the New York Times, you don't understand MAGA voters. I'm like, dude, let me tell you. Okay, my next door neighbor's a Trump appointee. I could just go on and on. And so seek out diverse communities. And by diverse, I mean along all spectrums. There are churches that are more diverse than others. There are organizations that are more diverse than others. And so if you are thinking about community involvement, yes, I'm not going to tell you don't get involved with a political organization that is right in line with your values, but don't make that the only thing you're doing, because it will make you more extreme. It will. It will separate you from your neighbors. It will. And so that's why churches, civic organizations, et cetera, I'm really looking for places with different viewpoints. And then I've totally, sadly, forgotten the second question. Oh, Mormon women. Yes. I remember the Mormon women, but I've forgotten the question. Peacemakers. Yes. Peacemakers. So this is very difficult. This is very difficult. I think there's a couple of ways to be a peacemaker. One is an easier way, one is a hard way. The easier way to be a peacemaker is by using your voice for peace as its own end, not peace as a byproduct of your victory, if that makes sense. Because everyone thinks there's going to be peace when I'm in charge and everyone agrees with me, right? That's a great way to get peace. Just agree with me. But if you're looking at, now, not peace at any price. So one of the things that has occurred for me, for example, is I was essentially just, not formally, but culturally and functionally expelled from my own denomination because of my opposition to Trump. And one of the reasons why I was no longer welcome at my church was for the sake of peace. That there would be people who would be so angry that I was there or speaking that they would disrupt the harmony of the church. So to give in to the bullies, they excluded me. That's not peace, right? That's capitulation. Peace and capitulation are different things. Peace without justice is not a real peace. That phrase, no justice, no peace, it has a negative connotation, which basically is like, until you give me justice, you don't have peace. But there's a deeper spiritual level that in the absence of justice isn't real peace. So the pursuit of justice is a component of peacemaking, in my mind, without question. So I think we stand for peace in that holistic sense, but at the same time, also, we have to model it. And this is where it gets really difficult. So I have a kind of a rule for myself, which is I will come strongly to the defense of my kids, my wife, vulnerable people. I'm going to come strongly to their defense. I'm going to be much more reluctant to just stand up to every slight that I experience. I firmly believe in the Beatitudes, and one of the hardest commands is turn the other cheek. One of the hardest commands is if you're asked for your coat, give him your cloak also. Like there's a self-denial that is inherent in peacemaking that is very difficult. And I'm not, as I said, I don't do these things perfectly. I'm a very flawed person. But I think that one of the ways we model peacemaking is that we are active for the justice of others and we are not alert to slights to ourselves. That we're able to absorb slights to ourselves, forgive, have grace, move on, move through. And the reason why I say that is a lot of conflicts emerge because of our personal wounding. And it could be right. We could have been treated unfairly. It could be bad. But I do think that, whenever it comes to peace, there's this phrase that people use, somebody's got to go first. Somebody's got to go first. And if somebody's got to go first and it's in something involving me, then I want to be the person. But it's very, 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 very difficult. There's no question about it, especially when there's this sort of weirdo MAGA masculinity that tells you that if you're not punching back twice as hard, that you're not a real man, right? And so you have to have the courage to ignore that and to pursue peacemaking. It takes a lot of courage. I'll tell you a little story about, I grew up, again, in a very fundamentalist church, and I've, at the risk of being oversimplifying, there's kind of two kinds of churches that I've experienced. One is the fight the world church, and the other one is the love your neighbor church. And so I say, shun the fight the world church, embrace the love your neighbor church. And I remember when I was young, and I was raised in a fight the world church, and you were told, get ready for persecution. Get ready for persecution. They're coming for us. They're coming for us. So you're like, I'm in youth group. Where's the persecution? I'm walking. I'm in high school in the 80s. And so, you walk by the bathroom door and the smoke, it's like the combination, like the pretty good kids were smoking cigarettes, the bad kids were smoking weed, and it's just smoke. And you walk in, I got to go to the bathroom. Hey man, take a hit from this joint. I'm a Christian. And he's like, come on, dude. And I'm like, that's it. That's the persecution. He's making fun of me this is how you're treated. Like any pushback to your faith was treated. That's the persecution. But then I experienced like death threats, people trying to come into my house, people trying to destroy my job, people, FBI showing up because we got a bomb threat, all this kind of stuff. And what was the source of that? What was the source of that? The source of that was not hating the people I was told to hate. That was the thing that put people into the next level of anger, not joining in the hatred. And so that is the first time I'd really experienced what I would call true adversity for my values, other than like people making fun of me or saying nasty things. And what was it rooted in? It was rooted in not hating the people I was told to hate. And I think that if you take that path and you choose not to hate the people you're told to hate, you can experience real adversity. But I also think that's what peacemaking is. Peacemaking is making the choice that I am going to not just not hate the people I've been told to hate, I'm going to love the people I was told to hate. And that's what peacemaking is.
David, you have given us so... You've given us so much to think about. You've been so generous with your wisdom. You have helped us understand, and honesty. You've helped us think not only about what's happening in our world politically, culturally, but you've also given us some moral, religious resources for thinking about how the role of virtue for each and every one of us. And that's something we don't have every day, and that's something that I'm personally very grateful for. And looking out in the faces of this audience as they listen to you, I know they are as well. So I'm going to ask one more time to please join me in expressing our thanks to David.